My name is Beth Fisher, and I'd like to welcome you to the 8th in our series of programs on the Civil War. Today's program is entitled Women in the Civil War, Myths and Realities, and it's part of a series of 9 programs we're doing that is in conjunction with the Civil War display that we have out in the main, I don't even know what to call it, in the main area of the first floor. It's part of Civil War 150, exploring the U.S. Civil War and its meaning through the words of those who lived it. It's a national traveling panel exhibition organized by the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History in partnership with the Library of America and through a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So if you haven't been by to see it, go take a look after the program. Today's program, our guest speaker is Jennifer Harbour. She received her Ph.D. from University of Iowa in 2008 in history and is currently the assistant professor of history at Ashford University. As of this fall, she will be the assistant professor of Black Studies at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. Her book, Bury Me in a Free Land, is about African American women in the Middle West during slavery and emancipation. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Is this on?
You should be, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Hi. Well, let's see. We have 2, 4, 6. We have 6 people, so I'm very excited to have 6 of you on such a beautiful day in Iowa City. I should also say that my mother's in the audience, and this will be the first time in 20 plus years that she's ever gotten to see me do a presentation, because I left home more than 20 years ago to go to graduate school and study such things, and home is in Detroit, so it's a pleasure for me to have her here today. Let me start by saying that I sort of got started studying women in the Civil War because one of my main concerns in the topic or in the field is really what 3rd graders and 6th graders and 12th graders know, because there's so much surrounding the history of the Civil War and certainly of American history in general that is what I would call mythical. So the talk today is kind of oriented toward the question of what were women actually doing? And that is a question that I asked when I started writing my book. And by that, I mean that literally. What were women actually doing? So that is one of the motivations here. We want to know, did they stay at home? Did they lock their doors and hide? Did they go out to the battlefields? I mean, there's a lot of questions that we want to know about women in the Civil War in terms of their involvement. So that's kind of my motivation today. First, the myths. And the myths about women in war are long and storied. And they're really about gender, of course, and they go to the question of what are women like. Certainly, as educators, we fight these things all the time. I fight them with my students every day. And they really go like this, that women are more emotional, that they are naturally more peaceful, that they always got left behind, they purposely got left behind when war broke out. That they wouldn't make good combatants for various reasons, because their physical bodies or because they were more emotional, and that they are naturally altruistic. So when it comes to war, women in the Civil War automatically decided they wanted to be helpmates and automatically decided they wanted to clean up the war, and were automatically, at least the way the myth goes, were automatically opposed to any war when it broke out. Largely that comes from the myth that says that women are the best at being mothers, that women are the best at being maternal, that everything else falls away. But when we look very closely, we see a very different story. And I suppose the one that is most hard for us as scholars is the idea that women are more peaceful, because the assumption is that women are starting peace movements when war breaks out. But obviously, when we look at world history, we see lots of women involved in war. Men obviously have made more war throughout world history. But women become very interested for various reasons, and I'll talk about that as we go through. Women generally appear in war in 3 different ways. The first, of course, is as mothers, and this is their quote-unquote good role. They also appear as victims, and this is kind of their this is how they appear neutrally, meaning that women are victims of war very often because rape is a particularly strong, powerful method of making war throughout world history, and this is true of the Civil War as well. Sorry. And they also appear as prostitutes. So this is sort of the typical mythical way that scholars today continue to insist, I should say mostly they're male scholars, continue to insist that this is where women appear when they're in the record for war. And these are the things that I constantly fight as a historian. So the old version of women in the Civil War is similar to what I just described to you. So when you get very closely involved with the history of women in the 19th century, we see that histories continue to insist, and I could show you a whole stack of books, continue to insist that women rolled bandages, right? So they did things that helped the troops, in other words, that they sewed and knitted, and they were very happy to sacrifice for the war effort. But their diaries and their letters tell us an entirely different story. And the idea of combat especially is something that is very problematic, or that we like to problematize, and I'll talk about that as well, because the Civil War is a modern war. And because it is a modern war, and because it is totalizing, women really don't have a choice, nor do children or really anybody else, whether or not they want to get involved in this war. So in 1862, Harper's Weekly presented the following illustration of the idea of women influencing the war in the following way. And again, you see this thread that women are helpmates. It's interesting to see them portrayed here as nurses. There's a Catholic nurse there on the left, in part because nursing was not typically women's profession during the Civil War. It became more so during the war, but prior to the war breaking out, it was certainly something that men were expected to do. And you sort of see the ideas of women sitting next to bedsides and women nursing men. And that's all very common for the primary sources of that day. And of course, any primary source, or especially illustration that you see from the mid-19th century, would of course reflect gender conventions about that time, so that they want to reinforce ideas about what women should be doing. But we know, of course, that war typically mediates gender roles. In other words, war brings opportunities in amazing and often good ways to women that are sort of startling for us as historians, because women look at the war and go, this may be a way that I can sort of make my entry, if you will, into a larger public sphere. So this is the, and it is today for my students, despite the fact that Gone with the Wind was a movie, from 1939, students still are familiar with these very one-dimensional images of the Civil War. So I usually start from this when I talk about the Civil War in my classes, because students want to know especially what it means for slaves, and especially what it means for white women who were slaveholders. How did they cope with the war? So it is, well, I'll just say it, it's mostly a racist view, obviously, of how women were to have behaved during the Civil War. And the Gone with the Wind, both the book and the movie, are really problematic for us. But I also like to point out that we can use a movie like Gone with the Wind to get at some of the truisms about what was actually happening during the Civil War, especially in the South. So we see some of the classic roles that I was just talking about. Scarlett O'Hara, she's very beautiful, she's spoiled, she is rich. She is the typical slaveholding woman in the mythical reality that says that she needs to be taken care of by Mammy, who is Happy, the so-called happy slave who was supposed to take care of Scarlett, and to the point, and I'll talk more about Mammy in a minute, but all this kind of sets up this one-dimensional portrait of women that we're very concerned about, because it means it has no depth, and women have very little agency, of course, in these kinds of portrayals. So, one of the reasons why I actually like Scarlett, believe it or not, is because she complains. Scarlett spends most of the movie and the book, and certainly like other women of her time, wondering how she got into this mess. Certainly she complains because she has lost her slaves and now she actually has to do some real work. But that is very true when we look at the primary sources of slaveholding women, that they lamented the fact that they were now in control of slaves, in control of plantations and farms, although the number of large plantations in which large numbers of slaves lived is actually very small. But I use her as a jumping off point because she doesn't automatically assume that the war is something for her to use her maternal side or her feminine side or her gentler side. She responds to the war in a very individualized, personal, angry way. And when we look at diaries, we see that women did this both in the North and the South. So the reality is, taking our cue from Scarlett, is that the Civil War is the first. Different historians disagree about what the first modern war is, but certainly it is one of those wars where it touches every man, woman, child, everybody living. You can't get away from the Civil War because it is literally in your backyard. And of course, the Northern Army marches into the South and brings the war to them. We also want to understand war as something in which real human beings experience it in ways that are that do allow them some degree of agency, despite the fact that there are so many people in modern warfare, especially today with the 20th century wars of ethnic cleansing, where we see women constantly being raped and being put in positions of terrific victimization, but yet we never want to see women in history as being just victims. So this is tough for us because we need to look very closely at our primary sources. So the movie Gone with the Wind actually starts with Scarlett saying, "Fiddle-dee-dee, war, war, war. This war talk is spoiling the fun at every party this spring. I get so bored I could scream." And there are plenty of diaries and letters that reflect Scarlett's view of this war, in part because Southern women were certainly kept on a pedestal. There is a whole cult of Southern womanhood, along with a cult of Southern manhood that expects women to remain in a private sphere and to be pretty quiet about things in their life. Certainly they're expected to get married at a young age. But when we look at what is really going on, we see some different things. Can we trust Scarlett and what she says? Yes and no. As I said a moment ago, Gone with the Wind's portrayal of slavery is wrong, 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 and I'll talk about that in a minute. Gone with the Wind's portrayal of women in the Civil War is mostly one-dimensional, but we see women actually getting dirty more toward the middle of the film when Scarlett actually has to, hoe potatoes and that kind of thing. She finds that she and her slaves are starving. She's finding different relationships with the men having left for war. She's finding emerging relationships with people in town, with slaves certainly. We know pretty well that Southern women had to learn to handle things in ways that were unprecedented. As I said earlier, the number of large plantations with large numbers of slaves is actually very small. So we see women operating their farms in ways that they hadn't been expected to do. So, and one of the things I think is really interesting about women in the Civil War is a lot of men who went to war asked their wives to accompany them. And I'll be talking about camp followers in a moment, but women weren't sure they wanted to do this. And we have several letters and diaries where women say they don't want to leave their children and they're afraid that if they go with their husband to camps and battlefields, that their children will forget them. So whether they were left with a grandparent or a slave or something like that, women expressed lots of fear about what would happen to them once the men left. And that really makes sense with our sort of understanding of war in general. But you should know too, certainly with women in the South, that they suffered lots of food shortages. There would be resulting bread riots, and that is one of my actually favorite topics about women in war, because women really do learn to put their foot down, especially near the end of the Civil War, and they're crying out for everyone who is left behind, that literally they are starving and they don't have food. Finally, it's important to note that women are terrified of being left behind because they're scared of their slaves and they're scared of insurrections. This is a very common thread throughout Southern history and the history of slavery in general. So this is sort of nothing new to us, those of us who are specializing in the history of slavery, but women write about this a lot in their diaries and in their letters. So women become the sole supporters of their families, including slaves. Some of the relationships among slave or between women and their slaves change over the course of time. So one of the things that we see that is terrifically interesting is Southern women changing their minds a little bit about how they see the sort of institution of slavery. I would not argue that Southern women decide that slaves should be given their due or certainly emancipated. Some of them do, a very small number. But yet, when we look closely at their letters and diaries, we see a lot of women in the Civil War who become closer to their slaves and feel as if they don't understand why their slaves would want to leave the South and be emancipated. So there's a struggle there, and that problematizes our understanding of women and of slavery, and women being put in a position where they now have to be in charge. Oh, thank goodness for me, women wrote letters, thousands and thousands of them, and I don't have many quotes here because I know it's kind of a boring way to talk about it. But you should know that women write letters to anyone who will listen. They write letters from in the North and in the Middle West and in the South. They write letters to Abraham Lincoln, to the Secretary of War, to the men who are in charge of the Confederacy, to the local federal marshals. Anyone you can possibly imagine, they write letters. And there's this humongous treasure trove in the National Archives where women are saying, look, this is how war is affecting me. And they talk about everything from their marital relationships to the relationships with their children, to slavery, to the local economy. And this is really, I guess I wish that more 6th graders and 8th graders would study them, because they really show us the large, to all of the things that women really care about. And it's not just about feeding their kids, and it's not just about their marriages, but the ideas about war. Certainly women in the South are thinking about slavery and secession. Women in the North are thinking about abolitionism. One of the great myths of the Civil War is that all Northerners were anti-slavery and so many Northerners were abolitionists. And actually the people who are truly abolitionists is actually a very small number prior to the war. But when we look at these letters, we see what women really believe is their due in terms of the government and is really their due for what the war will bring to them. And they have lots and lots and lots of complaints. One of the things that I think is important to note is that, and this is sort of a typical, almost mythical role for women, is that they made bullets and they worked in arsenals. But I want to point out that a lot of girls worked in these. This one is just in Fayetteville, Arkansas. You can see this illustration there. But lots of girls were involved in this. So young women who would have normally been married at this age end up working in this arsenal. This arsenal in Arkansas ends up being destroyed a little bit later in the war, obviously. But I think it's important to know that women don't necessarily come to the idea of making bullets or working in a munitions factory or arsenals because they think it's something that they should do for the war effort. They do it because they need money. So back to Scarlett for a moment. Women in the South, as compared to women in the North and in the Middle West, aren't as involved in benevolent societies prior to the Civil War, but that the rate of involvement in benevolent societies and any other kind of association, usually thought of in sort of a gendered way, in which all the participants are women, women get involved in this. And of course, in Gone with the Wind, you see Scarlett. She's all dressed in black and she's in mourning, but here she is at a fair to raise money. The fairs to raise money in the Civil War, it's important to point out that they really take on all manner of different attitudes and tones and approaches. So it can range from, a little bake sale at the corner to raise some money for uniforms or shoes or whatever they're doing, to the bigger ones that you would see in Gone with the Wind. So they really range. Women also are very strongly attached to the idea during the Civil War that they need to send things to the soldiers, so they have a tendency to do that. I should also say here that African American women, and I'll talk about them at the end, have their own, of course, so these are racially segregated. So the white women do not allow, especially in the North, do not allow the black women to take part in their group. So there's certainly a lot of racism involved where these groups are formed. Women also went to camps and hospitals, and this is one of the ones where, with the slide that I talked about with women being prostitutes, it's very common for women who are camp followers to be portrayed as going to camps or hanging around camps or battlefields because they're prostitutes, when in actuality, a lot of women followed their husbands or their uncles or their brothers. In part, and my students are always like, why would they go there if they're not, soldiers? Well, they need to go because they need to take care of the men. Because a lot of men, they have no idea what they're doing when it comes to cooking and cleaning and fixing their socks and you name it. They're not used to being able to take care of themselves. So, and of course, the perfect example in American history is the first Jamestown, in which no women were taken from England, and the men got to the other side. They got to the New World and went, oh, I don't even know how to make a fire. So one of the reasons why they starve is they don't bring any women with them. So here you see some examples of women who are camp followers, and that is a very different role for women than nursing, because women's nursing tends to be a paid occupation. It tends to be for single or unmarried women. And these women usually, like as I said, followed their husbands. The higher up in the ranks the husbands are, the more likely they are to have their wife with them. George Washington was famous for taking Martha Washington with him. And you, as a man, you might understand why they would want to have a woman to come and take care of them. So along comes Scarlett here, and we're still trying to figure out where Scarlett's place in all of this, despite the fact that we don't want to spend too much time on her because she is one-dimensional, she is racist, she is a slaveholder, so really who kind of cares? But I always remind my students that we can learn a great deal from Gone with the Wind by seeing what is absolutely totally wrong about it. First of all, Mammy is a caricature, and you see her today on cookie jars and on the side of maple syrup bottles. There is a wonderful museum in Michigan in the Grand Rapids area called the Jim Crow Museum, and it focuses on images of Mammy that have been passed down in American history that really come from Gone with the Wind and come from the idea that white women needed to be taken care of by black women, in part because white women were, especially in the South, were so delicate and so ultimately unable to take care of themselves. There up in the corner is another slave, and she, her image is a little bit different than Mammy in the respect that she is younger. She is generally portrayed as being stupid. She is the one that in the movie says she can't help deliver babies. But yet, then we look really close and we see, well, women are dressing as soldiers. So these images of women being unable to take care of themselves and having no agency, having no ideas about what they think about the war, why the war is being fought, about the government, about just general ideas. When we look and we see women like Sarah Edmund Seeley, who dressed as a man to join the war, there are some 250 soldiers who were women who dressed as men during the war. And later they received military pensions. And my students are always asking, well, is this something they do in secret? And the answer to that is really yes and no. So when we look at their letters and newspaper accounts and the primary sources that we have regarding this, there are really varying ideas why women want to dress as men and become soldiers, or sometimes because they feel very strongly about the war, sometimes because probably they have ideas about what today we would call being transgendered. They're all different kinds of reasons, but we know that when they ask for military pensions, they do expect to receive it, and they do expect that they should be given their due for serving in the war. Albert Cashier is one of my favorites there on the right because it's one of the ones that we have the best records for. There's a wonderful historian in Washington, D.C. called Deanne Blanton, who spent her entire adult career working on this, and she's given us, she's been able to cull a lot of these records from the National Archives and really see ideas about certainly women who appeared more masculine, or as I said today, who would probably self-define themselves as transgendered. Also, women felt like one of the good reasons would be they weren't sure what else they should do, and they like a lot of people in the 19th century, were very informed about politics, read the newspapers a lot, and really felt like they had something to say and something to, really wanted to participate, in other words, in the actual war itself. So there's some more images of women dressing as soldiers. And as I said, this isn't really an anomaly. There are some 250 of them. And really, if there were only two, as a women's historians, I would say that is still incredibly important. But there are several hundred of them, and we're actually still finding them. So one of the more common myths about women in war in general, and this comes from, bless her heart, Rosie the Riveter, is that when war occurs, women go to work. And so my response to that is always, women have always and everywhere worked, in part because they're at the bottom, I just wrote reproductive labor. They're doing everything from making the babies to carrying the babies to nursing the babies. In the case of women in Vietnam, in their war, they're pregnant and carrying the babies on their backs and very, very heavy anti-aircraft guns all at the same time. So women don't necessarily go to work all of a sudden because war occurs, but their ideas about their work certainly changes. Sometimes it is true, as in World War II, women do get more opportunities for different kinds of work, but that generally is something that is about white women. So when we talk about African American women in the Civil War, they've always and everywhere worked, in part because they needed to support their families. So the tone and subtleties of their letters are very different because they describe the war as interfering in their lives in obviously very different ways. So the letters that they write to Lincoln and the Secretary of War and all manner of other people really said, you know, I know that you don't think this war is about slavery, and we can talk about that at a later date, but let me just tell you, when it comes to my husband being in the colored troops, this war is not something that is working for me and my family because we are starving, because he doesn't make as much money as the white soldiers. So African American women in the Middle West and in the North are very well informed about what is going on in terms of pay, in terms of equity in the colored troops. So none of this means that they didn't work before, but that women in the Civil War look at what is work and what is paid work and what is unpaid work, and the kind of things that they need to do to help the war end is very different from maybe what had occurred right before the war broke out. Of course, women are nurses. Again, this is part of the mythical part of the story of the Civil War. But one of my favorite jobs for women during the Civil War are as sanitary commission inspectors, and this is really our first sort of attempt at public health in the middle part of the 19th century. And the sanitary commission was the civilian arm of the Union Army, and it went around initially just sort of wondering, you know, Lincoln doesn't have the money or the troops, and this war has broken out, and no one expects it to last very long. So the sanitary commission is put together by some people that are working at Frederick Law Olmsted, who's put together the public park in Central Park in New York City, and they're kind of pulling together the civilian arm. They know they need to raise money, but eventually women become field agents, and in Iowa as well. The woman there on the right is Mary Livermore. So women who are involved in the sanitary commission really are white upper class women, and women on the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum, black women who end up working in camps and kind of going around inspecting the diet, especially because it is very early on in the war that people realize not only do soldiers have enough calories or they're not getting enough food, but the kind of food that they are eating is problematic. And of course, there's Mary Walker. She's very famous for being one of the first doctors in America, women doctors. And there's Clara Barton. One of the things that I always use Clara Barton in terms of a teaching lesson is that she is one of our very early feminists, and of course they wouldn't have used the word feminist, but Clara Barton has very specific ideas about what she terms women's work, about women's roles in management, about women's associations with male soldiers. So she's a fascinating character. And one of the things that I like most about her is that she leaves us lots and lots of primary sources so that we can not only learn about Clara herself and where women entered the war, but all the women that worked for Clara. As I said, they were, women are, the one on the right is actually a reenactment. But this photo I showed you a few minutes ago, this is one of the things that I use in my classroom because if you really look very closely, you can see children and you can see different things there in the camp. And as I said in the beginning of the talk, what are women doing? So literally when they go to these camps, what are they responsible for? So when women write us letters and when they talk in their diaries, we want to know what they're doing. What are they doing? They're working very, 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 very hard to take care of everything that is going on in the camps, including fuel, including the animals, including putting together the tents and that kind of thing. So they do a lot of very physical labor. So despite gender conventions of the 19th century, women in this period are certainly not sitting around just doing knitting. They're not, they're really disallowed from achieving that goal of being sort of put on a pedestal because there's so much work and dirty work to do. Belle Watling, the image on the left is from Gone with the Wind as well. We have some pretty good records of women working as sex workers, both either as sex workers because they were sort of forced into prostitution, because they felt like women in New Orleans, for example, who come from African American families but who are able to pass as white. They do that work as sex workers because they want to make the money or because, as I said, they've been forced into it. So the stories are really very complicated. And then we also have examples of women spies who did some sex work as part of their spy work. So as I said, very complicated stories, and they're all, sometimes they're nothing alike. So you might be looking at one particular brothel in New Orleans and find that all of the women that are there, some 20 or 30 odd women, have different stories. Some of them are emancipated slaves. As I said, some of them are able to pass for white, so they have, so they're able to sort of adapt to changing notions of race in the South. Mammy. I have to say a few words about Mammy because she's very pervasive today. She is generally everyone's favorite in the myths of black women that we have in America. She is probably the most popular. There are several others, including the Jezebel, who is the sort of quote-unquote oversexed person. I think the thing that I dislike as a historian most about Mammy is that Mammy was a person who would have left her own children so she could go take care of other people's children, white children. And I always make the point that Mammy wouldn't have had a choice, and Mammy certainly wouldn't have preferred white children in the plantation household to her own, but the way the sort of story goes and the myth goes, she would have done that purposefully, which is really kind of quite silly. Mammy is a myth that is perpetuated by slavery's apologists, obviously, so the whole myth of a happy slave, whether that person is a man or a woman or even a child, continues to this day and really has very serious sexual undertones about it because white slave owners or planters who wanted to keep women close to them in the household. Harriet Jacobs is an author who wrote extensively about the sexual overtones and the possibility of rape that her owner constantly threatened her with. And historians also now think when they look at Mammy that most women slaves wouldn't have lived to be the kind of age that Hattie McDaniel was in her early 50s, early 50s and 60s, because they wouldn't have lived that long. So lots of problems with the relationship between Mammy and Scarlett. I mentioned Harriet Jacobs. This is a book that we use very often, especially when we're teaching. I told you that I cared a lot about what 6th graders and 8th graders know, and this is a book that I use with my own students because it tells us about a woman who escapes from slavery, who has a great deal of agency, and a lot of her agency as a woman in the Civil War is really in her mind. She's able to play lots of mind games with her planter. She very often pretends like she's stupid to get away from him. She ends up taking various lovers so she can really anger her slave owner. And she doesn't have a whole lot of control over her body or her destiny, yet she has a very interesting approach to when she writes in her book, Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl, that she really felt like she did the best that she could. And the story is really quite sad, but yet it has a happy ending in the respect that she does get her children back. She spends a long time hiding out in an attic. And so these are really the kind of stories that we like as historians because they complicate the story of Black women. So I've only really touched on the surface of women's roles in the Civil War. So in terms of myths and realities, there are hundreds of thousands of stories to be told. And as a historian of slavery, I'm looking for them all the time. And I think that what is most important to know about women, as I said in the beginning, and what they actually did during the war is that certainly gender roles are terrifically important, whether those change during the war. Modern warfare especially tends to be highly sexualized, so the threat of rape, the threat of physical problems is prevalent. Socioeconomic status and labor roles are terrifically important when we look at women in the Civil War. So whether women had money to begin with in the beginning of the war, whether they had any kind of status like Scarlett does, most of them end up suffering on some level because that's what modern warfare is. It attacks a civilian population. But we also see, thankfully, at the end of the war that we have 4 million slaves who earn their freedom, mostly because of self-emancipating. So the typical sort of illustration of women in the Civil War is this: nursing, helpmating, standing by the bedside, doing all of those typical things. But actually, one of the things that I like about Gone with the Wind is there's Scarlett, and she is trying to get away. Why is Scarlett trying to get away? Because it is awful. It is the worst possible thing that she can imagine. She has been kept on this pedestal through no machinations of her own. She slowly realizes through the film that there's lots of places she can't go and lots of things she can't do because she is a woman. So I would never, ever recommend to anybody that Gone with the Wind is a real portrayal of women in the Civil War, but it certainly helps us to see a little bit closer the kind of horror that women experienced, and certainly the kinds of worlds that open up to them. So war is never good, obviously, but war in the Civil War, just like World War II, makes a greater world for women to enter into, and that's not always a good thing, but it certainly allows them to really contemplate their gender roles and really escape some of the conventions that society has forced them into. That's it. Yes?
I don't know if it makes sense to compare.
I'm gonna let you use the microphone so people at home can hear you. There you go.
It may not be justified to compare different periods and historical periods, but we know that after the Second World War, when women had gone into the workforce in large numbers, after the war, they tended to go home, move to the suburbs, and have a lot of children. Now, what about Southern women after the Civil War? What happened?
The South. The first answer to that question is that the South is basically ruined after the war. It is a wasteland. It is decimated. The response on the part of Southerners after the Civil War ends is to create Jim Crow, to create black codes, because the concern is for all of the slaves who haven't yet escaped or haven't left for one reason or another, not because they wanted to, but because they remained in the South, is to put up new conventions for both race and for gender. So women are again trapped into those conventions, and they become a lot of women who work on farms and who don't have money end up doing a lot of physical labor that they might have not expected. But because it is the end of the planter generation or the heyday of planting, a whole new system needs to come in, and that is Jim Crow. And women a lot of Southern women buy into those new race conventions just as well as they had during the Civil War and before, because it's very important for them to maintain their superiority, certainly over blacks. And your question about World War II, see, I think it is interesting if we look at all different kinds of war and women in war in general, because what we're able to cull from that about gender conventions, for instance, you were talking about women going into the suburbs and having lots of babies. I would argue that they're able to do that if they have the money to do that. So that women who are poor, women who are Hispanic, women who are black, would love to be able to go get a new dishwasher and some of the things that women are getting after World War II, and spend the time with their children, but they're still working 2 and 3 jobs. So when we look at the post-war numbers of employment, the women who are doing that or who are trying to get back into these jobs are the women on the lower socioeconomic spectrum.
So the women who did fight in the Civil War, they received pensions, and how did they go
Some
about?
of them did. They just applied for them.
But
just
the one slide you had 1886, so it took a long time for that.
And we have lots of examples of, so Deanne Blanton is able to sort of separate these women out into different groups. So you have a group of women who would have died on the battlefield, and a lot of them were revealed to be women when they were taken into the surgery. And then you have women who didn't apply for pensions because their husband applied for pensions because they had gone with their husbands. And then you have women, and they're not a huge number, and the last number I saw was about 25 of them who had applied for these pensions, really thought that they deserved it. So yeah, and the whole pension system does take a long time, and for historians, we're kind of grateful because you have this paper trail that they leave. So it's not unusual for any kind of normal pension to take a long time because you needed proof, and you have all these letters going back and forth between DC and where these people were at home, saying this is where I served, this is where I mustered in, but obviously they don't have, a lot of times they don't have the records that we would like to suggest that they had done, an honorable service. So I'm so grateful to them for applying for pensions because I love the part where they go, hey, I deserve this.
Just to follow up on that, was there a prohibition against women serving? And if so, did that become a debate when the women applied for pensions?
There's no specific prohibition on women serving because I think people, and my guess is as a historian, that people went, oh, well, that women wouldn't want to enter into combat, right? I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Was there a debate about giving them the pensions then?
But the debate that I have seen really is a very interpersonal debate among family members where they say, I told Aunt so-and-so that I'm going to go do this, and Aunt so-and-so said, are you kidding me? But in smaller villages. And actually, I meant to mention this, one of the better representations that I think, if you want to see a film about the Civil War, is Cold Mountain, in which both the book and the movie, where one of the characters talks about men made this war and left this war for us. And I think a lot of women that I have studied and a lot of their diaries and letters really reflect that. We're stuck here with all of this stuff, and that really ranges from rape to taking care of slaves to starvation and bread riots, and yet they're off doing God knows what, so at least that's a better representation.
Were there any sort of sequelae that we don't ordinarily associate with war that you came across in the letters? What I'm thinking is that in our family, the problem became one of alcoholism and mental illness. We had soldiers who went in at 14 who had no idea the horror that they were going to see, and they just flipped out. And when they came back, they spent their entire lives in the Soldiers and Sailors Home, leaving a wife and children to fend for themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, because today we might call that PTSD.
That's
but
right.
Of course, they wouldn't have called it that then.
Yeah.
But that's really, I think, a fascinating track to look at those. So why you could never just study the Civil War, right, or any war, is
That's
because
right.
it keeps going on and on and on, is that all these letters 20, 30, 40 years later are still talking about these people who are so mentally ill.
And what about sort of the factor of opening the world? What I'm thinking is that there was an enormous amount of confusion about where somebody was and who he was.
Yes.
And women would travel long distances hunting for soldiers after the war, during the war, trying to figure out what became of people because they had no identity. And if they died on the battlefield, they had no way of knowing. And they would talk to friends, relatives, anybody who had served with supposedly their loved one. Did you see him die? Where did he die? And so on.
Yeah, and to be able to bury your loved ones. or
But
to
they
go
might,
under that.
never have gone more than 20 miles away from home, and here they were, 300 or 400 miles away in a whole new land.
Yeah, and I think the most common question I get from my students about slavery in the Civil War is, why didn't they just escape? And I have this whole riff that I do on why slaves couldn't just escape. But I always tell them the first thing that anyone does when this war is over is they looked for their loved ones, whether they were
Yeah.
white or black, and black especially. They put up newspaper ads and pamphlets, and they plastered the world with any kind of piece of paper with a photograph or description of the person that they loved. And then they set out on foot trying to find them. And
Yeah, the carte de visite was these were mass produced right about the Civil War, and people would travel places hanging on to one of those with a picture of their loved one. Have you seen this man?
yeah, which I suppose is just human nature, isn't it? To
Yeah,
find
yeah,
them.
it sure is. But I think about, the women of Vietnam who for the first time are facing missing limbs, arms, legs. Their husbands and brothers and sons come back without pieces. And this was very new to a lot of them. They had never seen a crippling
Yeah.
of people that way.
So the invention of wheelchairs and the way that medicine changed in those times,
Yeah.
I think is
Yeah.
tremendously fascinating, because as the treatment for wounded on the battlefield gets better and better through World War I, II, and certainly Vietnam, then you have this huge groups of people coming home without limbs, but then society doesn't want to look at it. As
Yeah,
today.
and we've been involved with Whitman from the other end of it, and his descriptions
Oh.
of nursing on the battlefield are gory.
Yeah, very gory. Beautiful stuff. Excuse me. It's okay. Thank you.
So I'm backing up a question. When the women filed for their pensions, they did it as themselves or their alias?
Both.
Both.
Usually they put both names on there, but it is that's why I mentioned women adopting a kind of transgendered self-identification, because they very often put their male names. And I would guess if we go back and talk to them, they would say that they would have lived their lives as men had they been given the opportunity. And some of them continued to do that.
Okay. And then the other question I had was about Fidelity.
Yeah.
For the soldiers and the wives, if
Yep.
there was these gals following the camps,
Yep.
what were the ratios or whatever?
It's a class and it's a gender question, because in the 19th century, for men, especially of the upper classes, to frequent brothels is very expected. There's a very strong French and English tradition that says men of the upper classes marry their wives to make babies because of bloodlines, ideas about race. But they frequent brothels pretty much without impunity. That is certainly okay. Now, for 19th century white womanhood especially, you need to be pure, and of course women aren't supposed to step outside of marriage, nor are they supposed to enjoy sex or any of that kind of stuff. So there's all these ideas about marriage and about sexuality. One thing I think is most interesting about what I can say about that in gender in the Civil War is that there are lots of brothels in New Orleans and Natchez, especially where there are women who are former slaves who I said could pass, who would identify as quadroon or octoroon by racial standards. I hate that word race, but, and men loved them. They talked about this all the time in their diaries and their letters, and they would stand for hours at a time and pay big bucks to sleep with these women because they were considered sort of exotic. And of course, these are the same men who were planters and slave owners. So there's always this striking irony and dichotomy between this idea that planters are constantly trying to rape or romance their slave women, but yet they would say that those women have different diseases, that those women are below them because of their race. So they contradict themselves all the time. But in the 19th century and certainly the early 20th, men, ideas about fidelity.
Do you think it was different for like just your average farmer, soldier, and church-going wife?
Right. And so when we look at those letters of diaries, we do have women going, now wait a minute, let me think about this. The first thing I would say about that is that you would have to have the money to go to a brothel. And so men and women have discussions about whether or not you would even be able to step out in your marriage with a prostitute, because you would need the money to do that, and you would need Certainly some communities in the Middle West, for example, they wouldn't have had brothels, or you would have had to go to the next town over or whatever. So, and I think those narratives about sexuality in the 19th century where it concerns sex workers are still emerging for us. We're still trying to sort of track down whether or not women, they certainly knew that they were getting the short end of the stick, as it were, in terms of fidelity in marriage, but remember too that a lot of women wrote to us and said, I don't even like him, right? So, I mean, I have to make babies, but since it was an arranged marriage, why would I even worry that he's, out, right? At the saloons. By World War I, of course, by the first part of the 20th century, the concern, of course, becomes sexually transmitted diseases in the narrative, and the conversation really changes then, because people go, okay, now this is different, because if you're going to come home and you're going to bring syphilis, now I really care. Yeah.
I'm curious, as an offshoot of the pension, you mentioned that some of the women died on the battlefields. I was wondering if those who joined in secrecy or didn't tell anyone they were joining, and say the young men that were underage as well and used aliases, if they died on the battlefields, if they were treated afterwards, after it was found out that she was a woman, was she given the same kind of burial as, say, a 12-year-old who also was killed on the battlefield?
It kind of depends on where they ended up dying. But by that time in the Civil War, most men and women are dying where they have been wounded or killed, and they end up in mass graves, or they end up thrown into some sort of ambulance. So it kind of depends at what point they're being discovered. So if they're taken into some sort of surgery and the surgeon discovers that this is a woman, then and we're still matching up those surgeons' diaries to the women to find out what their sort of reaction was. And a lot of times their reaction is like, they're obviously very stunned. So usually, as Deanne Blanton has argued, the families would be contacted or something would be put in the paper so someone could come and fetch their bodies. But it is such a mess at the end with bodies and people and burials that it's kind of up to you to go and find your loved one. Yeah.
The prisoner of war camps. Oh, here, it's coming.
The prisons, the prisoner of war camps. You know, there are an awful lot of people in the Confederate cemetery on Arsenal Island.
Right.
Are any of them women? In other words, were women sent to Andersonville and to other prisons as prisoners of war and died there?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know.
Next Tuesday.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming.
That's a good question.
I want to point out that on Thursday night, we have our last of the Civil War commemorative programs. It's Ed Folsom from the University of Iowa talking about Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Matthew Brady, and the title of his program is Making Art Out of Mass Death. Take that for what you will. But that's 7 o'clock Thursday night in this room. So thank you all for coming. Thank you.